So, good morning, Jim.
Good morning, Sandra and all.
We are in the late afternoon, and I'm very glad to welcome today you. That is Dr. Jim Weiss. He has a Bachelor and Ph.D. in experimental and mathematical psychology from the University of Washington. But as I know, he has taught designers and architects and engineers, as well as psychologists. I know Jim from a joint project on that we do together on fractals and how they can be implemented into the design, which is extremely interesting. But I'm also very glad that Jim has joined us today, because especially his work on spatial habitability has influenced my own work years and years ago. So I'm happy to hear now him talking about this subject as well. Jim has over 140 publications in the academic and professional literature. He has won several awards in industrial design and architecture as well. And today he's retired, but he's continuing as a planning commissioner on livable and sustainable community for the city of Richland. So thank you again, Jim, for joining us. Please take the floor.
Yes, Sandra, thank you so much. And hello, everybody, at least as those of you I can see and more on my screen here. It's my first time doing this internationally across Zoom, so we'll see how it goes. Just to add a little bit to the introduction, Sandra's in the middle of her career. I guess some of you are, a lot of you are starting yours. I'm at the end of mine. I'm retired now. I did start out, as Sandra mentioned, as an experimental and mathematical psychologist. But in my very first job, I was hired as a young professor at The Ohio State University. My very first position, the chairman of the industrial design department came over to my office and asked me if his students could take my introductory statistics class. And he thought that design students should know statistics. And it turned out I was the only statistics professor on the Ohio State University that said, yes, yeah, come on in. And those design students taught me as much as I taught them. And I learned from them in the class that design students were having all the fun in the world. And they would invite me to come over to their design studios and their crits. And I realized that a lot of the things I had learned in psychology could be translated into design research. And so I started this shift in my life to into design research. I ended up, while still there at Ohio State, I ended up with a courtesy appointment also in the industrial design department, teaching part-time there. And then I left Ohio State and actually took a position for a year at the Sonderforschungsbereich in Mannheim, the University of Mannheim there, and then another year at the Technical University of Darmstadt, where I worked a lot with architects and planners. I came back to the United States, taking a position as a psychologist ever hired as a professor of architecture who didn't have an architecture degree. But this was in 1975 when architecture was going through this reformation of sorts of being very interested in human-centered design for the first time. So I was the first psychologist hired into a major university in a position as a professor of architecture. And I was there for 13 years. So that's what got me started. And I've still gone on and continued that. So I'm really looking forward to this again. You bring me back to some of the happiest years of my life, being able to talk to you again. Now, I've And any questions from any of you before we get started? I've got like 30 slides here that I've prepared to sort of go through and talk about some things, but you can interrupt me on the way through as you want, and then we can also have some time to talk and exchange views and longer questions after I'm finished. Anything to start off here? No?
I'm just looking forward to the talk.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to be sure you guys were listening out there. Yeah. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to call up my, and that took over my screen, so I can't see you now. I was going to put this on, let's see. If I share screen. And everyone can see that?
Yes, we
Everyone can see that? Shaking heads. Okay. Let me see if I can get a different view here. I don't want to lose you. Get the slideshow view. There we go. Okay. So what I've titled this is that how design psychology and neuroscience explore the space between, because that's what your studio was all about. And what I've got three basic things that I'd like to accomplish in this. And that is, first, I wanted to convince you all that the space between is much more than just a metaphor, that it actually can be measured, it can be utilized. We're going to explore some of the directions and dimensions of what the space between means in design and architecture. And I want to show you, mostly from my own experience in using it, how the space between can either, manipulating it can prevent design problems, solve them, and actually guide your future design development. All right, something we've all seen, space between. You notice here's a park, it's a park bench, or not a park bench, but a street side bench for bus. And you notice the dividers there on the bench, where you've got those little arms that come out from the back, and you notice that the back of the bench is separated so that you've got spaces for 3 people to sit down, maybe 2 of them together on that one end, because one separation is larger than the others. And so this is creating, space between by actually putting in dividers or by breaking things up. This has the added benefit these days by putting those little arms in there that you don't have homeless people sleeping on these benches because you can't stretch out on them. But you've all seen things like this. So we're used to these kinds of manipulations. You can do it not only spatially, you can create space between, but you can do it with lighting and other kinds of elements. So you take a look at that first slide there, and you all probably realize that creating an overhead element, putting an overhead element captures the space beneath it. And then if you create a lighting difference around the edge of that space, it separates it even more from the outer space. So there we've got with a tent and some lighting around it set up outdoors. And the other one is a restaurant scene where you're separating diners in the restaurant, and you see they've separated them in 3 different ways, and one of which is actually have separate tables. And the other way is by dropping a light element over the top, and that element here is a large round element, so it's a spatial element, but it also creates a lighting increase over the tabletop, which creates a highly lighted space over the table, which also separates space. And then if you notice behind each of the tables, well, you've got the separating wall behind them, the half wall there actually has different columns and small separations. So that creates a private space, a semi-private space for each pair of diners. One of the exceptionally enjoyable early parts of my career was that once I gave a lecture on vandalism and vandalism designing against vandalism. And this fellow came up afterwards and he said to me, he says, "You think you've given a lecture on vandalism, you haven't. You've really given a lecture on restaurant design." What? Turns out he was one of the most well-known restaurateurs in Seattle. And he hired me as a consultant. This was while I was a professor there. And I worked with him for 10 years on designing of all of his restaurants. And so we took all of the lessons that we'd learned about, a security design and even space habitat design, and we're applying them in restaurants. And we actually pioneered a lot of the very, very first things that have become very common in restaurant design these days. I could give an hours-long lecture on restaurant design today here if you don't get me started. Anyway, onwards. Other ways of dividing up space. We have different ways of dividing up space in banks here, where we go into a bank and you write out your check or your deposit slips, things like that. And of course, how do you keep those people apart, but actually keep them, give them some privacy, but you also want to have be very efficient and have a lot of people be able to work at a desktop at once. So you see all these very different types of designs that are being used in bank lobbies, and some of them angle people and they put elements in between them to create privacy. Some of them just separate them out and then they put the deposit slips in the middle, and some of them use different shaped elements on the end to indicate that there's very different spaces. And there's a wide variety of these used in American banks. But another thing that gets involved with this individual space in banks is security. Back in 1984-85, I led a team. We did the largest study on bank robberies and bank interior design that was ever done by the American Banking Institute, or the Bank Administration Institute. And at that time, there was a tremendous amount of argument going on of whether American banks should take the direction of European banks and go to a system where you completely walled off the tellers and everything like that, because we were having an increase in bank robberies. But the people who marketing in the banks said, no, we want to keep our banks open and friendly. And the question is, could you end up designing bank lobbies that deterred robberies and yet also looked open and friendly and accepting to customers? And it turns out the answer is yes. And a lot of it was how you manipulated the space between, particularly the space between the user of the bank, the client of the bank, and the tellers. When we finished doing our study analyzing hundreds of bank robberies, especially in and around the Seattle area, we found out the single most important determinant of whether a bank was going to be robbed or not was something called the interteller distance. And that's how far apart your tellers were on the teller line. And 5 feet seemed to be the magic distance. If you had your tellers further than 5 feet apart, your chances of getting robbed were going way up. Well, what really increased the chances was where you had situations like these here, where you have columns that separate the banks, the bank tellers from one another. Now you can see here, these are modern bank tellers. You can see here how the spaces are separated out now. They've got different mats. And they have these little columns, but they don't go all the way. They're just meant to sort of give more of a sense of privacy than real privacy. But you notice that between the tellers, they can still see each other. And that is because it turns out that bank robbery is really an exercise in control. Most of the people that rob banks never show guns. They just walk up and they show the teller a note demanding money. And the whole purpose is to control the teller. But if the teller is close enough to another teller where that teller can look over and see what's happening, this greatly deters the robber because that control isn't there. So keeping the visible space and keeping a moderate amount of space between tellers turns out to be the most effective way of deterring bank robberies. And when our study came out, it did change we had a lot of other recommendations in there too. And it did change the entire design of American banks. This was 85 for at least 10 or 20 years. Some of them they're going very open now and very different. You have bank cafes and all, but it had this spatial this analysis of the way bank robbers use space had a very significant effect on bank design here in the United States. Okay, you've all heard about proxemics, and Sandra told me you talked about proxemics. When a psychologist looks at proxemics of space, we look at it in terms of perceptual control mechanisms. And that is, as you're arranging the space, what are you really doing that's affecting the perceptual controls that people use in human behavior? And there's basically, 4 of these. One is interpersonal speaking distance. People choose to speak different distances apart, and usually you choose a greater distance if it's if it's a stranger, or if it's a person that is, say, your superior. You don't stand as close to them as you stand as close to a colleague and all. It's the making and breaking of eye contact as you seat around each other. It's relative height. And a lot of times this had been reflected in the height of chairs and everything. There's the chairs at the end of the table and the chairs at the side chairs. And then it's your postural freedom. The person that stands at attention, they do not have postural freedom of movement as the person, say, that they are reporting to as they're giving their report. And so we've got a picture here of some people working around a table. You can imagine where where would, if you were going to want to really control a meeting like this, where would the chairman place their position? Anybody want to guess? Nobody wants to guess. Go on, somebody take a guess. Tell me.
Well,
where were the
head of the table, probably.
At
the head of the table, probably.
At the head of the table, right down at the end of the table. And in fact, if it wouldn't be an oblong table like this, it would be a long rectangular table with a distinctive head end. And when I worked for the government a lot, whenever I went into a government meeting, the table was actually T-shaped, and the chairman always sat up at the head of the table in the T, and then the rest of us sat in that long line, down the length of the T, so that we were directly in eye contact control of the chairman. And we all had to look at him, turn and look at him. And it was always a him, by the way, in those days. We always had to turn and look, and he could keep us all under his gaze at the same time. Now, if you're having a chairman that is just more egalitarian, what they do, they'll sit in the middle of a table like this. And sizes of tables and length of tables can have a tremendous effect. Some of you may have realized the years that went on in the Vietnam War, where the US and North Vietnam argued over the size and shape of the table, particularly the shape of the table for peace talks. And it held off peace talks while the Vietnam War raged for about 2 years, while the shape of the table was argued over. And a lot of people died during that time. And there's some stories going on international, when there's international peace talks between the United States and the Soviet Union on missile treaties and so forth, whether, on how big the table would be and where the table would be. And on one meeting, they had the table where they set the long table against a large window. And then they opened the window, and the Russians all sat on the side of the window, and the Americans had to look out when the sun came in the window and could have blinded them with glare. So there are all these games being played. But I mean, proxemics of space ends up being utilized everywhere in many, many different ways. There we go. The power of relative height. I mentioned relative height. Here's a problem, actually, my design students, I used to have, when I ran a design research studio at the University of Washington, we were every once in a while, we're given problems by places around the university that had design problems. And this problem came up when the university opened its new undergraduate recreation center. It was a gym center. And to enter it, you had to have a card, a fee card that shows you've done this, and you had to show it to a clerk as you entered the door. Well, they chose the clerk, a young woman who would be by the door. And if you were going to sit a clerk, if you're going to put a clerk sitting at the door to show your fee card to as you entered in, let me ask you, which of these arrangements would you choose? Would you choose the top arrangement there, a person sitting down at a nice table, or the bottom arrangement with the person lifted up and sitting at a high stool with table? Anybody want to make a proposal? Which would you choose?
For me, the better one is the second one, because the people will be like, they will stand up, the other people that comes into this building.
They would, you're talking about you would choose the high one or the low one? I didn't hear.
The high one.
Yeah, well, you know, they didn't do that. They chose the low one. And so what happened, of course, is all of these, mostly guys, you know, coming in to use the center at that time. This was in the late 70s. Most of the guys, they just blow right past the young woman sitting there at that chair. And the rec center managers were just beside themselves. They had signs up and everything, and people just ignored it. All of that stopped. They came us. We brought in the second type of chair. We raised the young clerk up, put her at eye level so that she confronted everybody at eye height when they came in, and now they all stopped and they showed their things. So this is the power of relative height. And you know, they thought they were going to have to like put up more signs or put a barrier up. Nope, it was just a matter of getting the social control of that space between the you know, the receptionists there, the checker and the people coming in. Okay, another example. This was a noise problem that came up in the undergraduate library at the time. This was the picture of the outside, the left of the Odegaard undergraduate library at the University of Washington. And the picture on the right is, you can see it's an open plan library. And what would happen is that people would walk in those doors. You see those dark doors there on the left-hand side. Students would walk in those dark doors off the outside square. And of course, they'd be talking to each other. They'd walk in, there was a vestibule there. And several feet inside that vestibule, there were turnstiles that they went in, okay? And those turnstiles were signaling the entry to the library. Well, what happened is that students would walk into the vestibule. They had been talking with each other. They'd continue talking to each other, and they wouldn't stop talking until after they had gone through the turnstiles. On that picture below you on your right-hand side there, the vestibule is off out of view to the bottom of your right of the screen. I'm sorry, I couldn't find a picture of it. But they had signs up saying, please stop talking, you know, shh, quiet, everything. And none of these worked. And they were beside themselves. And they saw this as a sonic problem. And they said, how do we stop this noise, you know, from conversations from the students as they're talking, as they're coming into the vestibule here, from going up and going everywhere inside the library. So I'll give that to you now as a quick problem and say, what do you think? You get this problem. How do you stop students talking, or how do you stop the sound impacts from students talking as they come into a vestibule in an open plan library? Anybody?
I'd say move the signs. Or what I also would suggest is maybe work with lighting. So create a very stark contrast between the outside and the inside. So you kind of notice that when you go inside that there's a different atmosphere, maybe based off the lighting.
Well, for
Yeah.
for me, I would create a transition space, like a space like in between the exterior and the library, so that you really feel that you're going inside with a much smaller volume. That makes you realize that now you're not outside anymore, but you're in a study place.
Uh-huh. Anybody else? There's no wrong answer here. You know, come on, we're just throwing things out. Well, interestingly, because we've got other things to go into, interestingly, what they had thought, the librarians had thought, was that they were going to enclose the vestibule. And so that the idea of like creating a smaller enclosed interim space, that's the way that, and they thought, well, how do we design this and put this in? But we actually came up with a much simpler solution, and that simpler solution was indicated by the gentleman who mentioned lighting. And that is because, imagine this, imagine when you're going from a bright outside, inside, what are those spaces that you enter when you go from outside to inside that you shut up, that you stop talking? And it's those spaces that where you have a strong decrease in lighting, like going from outside into a theater, or going outside into a church. And when you have a strong lighting difference or a decrease in ambient illumination, you end up being quiet. So what we did instead is we turned off all the lights in the vestibule, and then we used pliocene to darken the vestibule because all the light was bouncing off the square. And we darkened the vestibule. And sure enough, what happened is when students came in, they would go from a bright outside space to a dark inside space. They'd continue walking, they'd stop talking. By the time they got through the turnstile, they were now in the library. The students recognized that the turnstiles to them denoted library space. They'd stop talking. So all you had to do was stop them from talking during that brief transition point, that space between. And you could do that with lighting alone. Now, here's the funny thing. Sometimes we felt gleefully happy that we had solved this problem and could do it so cheaply. But we got the bum's rush out of there because that's not the way the library people wanted us to solve the problem. They wanted us to come back with all kinds of design recommendations so they could go to the university and ask for all this remodeling that would include, sonic kinds of treatments and all. So we did that for them and we showed it would work, but they never took that to the university administration because they wanted the argument, for much further renovations. So the lesson there is know what your client really, really wants before you solve your problem for them. Okay, another spatial history problem. This one should be close to Sandra's heart. This was the first space station, Skylab, launched by the United States between 1973 to 79, had a three-man crew, three-man crews on different range of missions. There was a mystery aboard this space station. And if you take a look there down in what they call the workshop, and you can see my cursor, the Skylab used a division of space that was circular. So they cut around this was an old Saturn booster rocket that had been converted. They cut around it, so you divided up interior space around the interior of a circle, and these three elements down here you see in the bottom part of the left. These three elements were the crew cabins for the three-cabin crew, and they were actually leftover space after you had put in everything else. Those were leftover space, and they deliberately divided up that space so that the space would be equal. in size. However, for every crew that came up and used Skylab, the commander always took one of the spaces. And I think it was this one right here. And when they asked the crew members, well, why is the commander, why do you give commander takes to one space? They'd say, well, because it's the biggest space. You know, we're in a military organization and commanders, you know, higher rank always get more space. But it turns out it wasn't more space. And this was a mystery. NASA does not like mysteries of any kind. So they were looking at this, trying to figure out how to do it. And finally, my students and I, when we were doing what we called the HUSH study for NASA, Human Spatial Habitability Study, we finally solved that problem for them. We showed them that it was the isovist that was different for those spaces. And the isovist, anybody raise your hands, have you ever heard of isovist before? Talk about isovist? No, I see some heads shaking. I'll try to go down here and catch more of you. Yeah. Isovist, anybody? Isovist? No? Oh, I should have put more slides in on this then, but I didn't. Okay, the isovist, very important. It's the space that's visible from a given point. Imagine that instead of, you know, rays of light coming into your eye, imagine the old idea that rays of light are going out of your eye, and those rays go out until they hit an opaque surface or an occluding edge. And now you look around and you see those isovist radials, they go out. You're at this point here, and you're the observer, and you go out, and they go around a space until they hit all these edges. Well, that whole distribution of isovist radials is the isovist. And the isovist is the visible space from a given point. Now you can take that distribution, and that distribution is a statistical distribution. You can find the mean of it, you can find the variance of it, you can do all kind of statistics on it to describe the quality of the visible space. And we were doing that as the basis of our human spatial habitability. We were using isovists. Well, it turns out that if you take those spaces in the Skylab space station and look at the size of the area of the isovists, that was all pretty much the same. NASA was right. Those space stations were the same size. But the variance of the isovist was much greater in that one crew cabin. And what drives variance of the isovist is long views. So anytime you've got a long view corridor or view axis of some kind, this drives up the variance, just like you have a big number in a distribution, it drives up the variance of a statistical distribution. So higher variance gives the impression of spaciousness. And that's what was driving the feeling that all the crew members had, that one of the cabins was larger. Now, actually, this discovery, and we went on and did some more studies on this while I was visiting with NASA. This discovery actually later on led to NASA's decision to go with horizontal decks in the International Space Station as opposed to the radial decks that had been used in Skylab. When they did all the engineering studies, because NASA was looking at, they had a successful space station up there with Skylab. When they did all the engineering studies, it turns out mass distribution, everything like this, was equal to what we call a horizontal deck layout or a radial deck layout. And by the way, in NASA EASE, the horizontal deck is called the hot dog model, and the radial deck is the bologna slice. But all of the engineering thing was equal. And so it came down to human factors. And like, is anyone better than the crew? And so I remember they calling me up and talking me brought me into a meeting, and I said, which is better? And oh, the horizontal deck is much better because it gives long views. And of course, if we if we go back on those radar, you always have the same view in every direction, but you have long views. So that's why we have horizontal decks in the International Space Station. Okay, what's causing all of this? What's causing all of this is actually in the way space starts to get encoded in your brain. If you look into a brain, down in the limbic system of your brain, there is an organ called the hippocampus. And it is called the hippocampus because it looks like a seahorse. There's the hippocampus on this side, and there's a seahorse, right? And you see why it looks like a seahorse. The seahorse, or the hippocampus, is where spatial memory, it's incredibly important for memory. It's incredibly important for early processing of spatial perception. And the fascinating thing about the hippocampus is that it doesn't encode space the way space is, you know, in a canonical sense, in a measurable sense, in independently measurable sense. It encodes space the way it's experienced as the organism moves around in it. Well, what's happening as the organism moves around in space? Space opens and closes. And if you look at the way the space is experienced, it turns out that there's two encoding schemes the hippocampus uses that end up being primary, that's sent on to the other parts of the visual system for higher order processing. The first part is spatial expanse. That is just how much space is around you. The second part is direction. How far is that space? You know, and if you think about that, well, that's just what ISOVIS captured. So one of the things is that, you know, when we first started doing research with ISOVIS, and we didn't discover it, it was actually discovered by an architect at the for his master's thesis back at not Harvard, anyway, one of the Eastern schools. And anyway, we were all wondered why the ISOVIS seemed to work so well. Well, all these years later, these decades later, when we're starting to understand how the hippocampus in our brain encode space, we're beginning to understand why the ISOVIS works as such a wonderful set of measures, because basically you're mathematizing exactly the way the hippocampus of the human brain encodes space. So the research being done here, this, you know, we talk about Academy of Neuroscience for architecture and all this, and neuroscience and architecture. Boy, this is one of the strong success stories that we have in understanding the hippocampus, and then bringing that into a measure like the use of ISOVIS and actually using that in design. Okay, another problem for you. This is the Marketplace North condominiums in Seattle. And this shows the real power of ISOVIS in the space between. Let me show you. The Marketplace North condominiums, if you watch my cursor, that's these condominiums sitting right here, okay? So you've got that mid-rise building with the sloping roof behind, and then you've got these lower ones, you know, down here. And this is going down a hill. You notice this is, it's cascading down a hill. Now, you have to ignore all this other stuff around it, all these other buildings around it, because when this was first proposed in 1978, it was the only building there on the north end of Seattle, and north end of Seattle was an extremely rundown, industrialized area, and that was being all renovated. And at that time, there was nothing but a big space there, because the big empty lot, because all of the buildings had been torn down. And the city hired a developer to develop it and proposed to put in these new condominiums. And this was the first downtown living to be done in Seattle, okay? Very first downtown living. And so the developer, doing his homework, went out and did a little marketing study to find out who's going to come live there. And he found out that the people who wanted to come live there were empty nesters from the east side of the lake, Lake Washington. And these are people who, they were empty nesters. Their kids had gone. They wanted to come down and have downtown living and go to shows and things like this. But they were very concerned about security because they'd had their own homes on their own big lots. And here they were going into a condominium setting. And I have a cat coming on my lap now, so you may see a tail come in front of you. There we go. And she's down there, happy. All right. Now the problem was the designer, the developer hired one of the best architecture firms in the city. And they started submitting plans which had to go to the design commission, the city's design commission. The problem was that all of these plans, when they submitted them to the design commission, rejected them because they says, it looks like a private enclave for the rich. And Seattle had a ethic at that time that we didn't want a private enclave for the rich sitting there on the north end of the city. Well, actually, though, it was a private enclave for the rich because these were wealthy homeowners from the east side of the lake. They were very concerned about security. And so the site had to be walled off. You couldn't penetrate it. It had to be private. So you had to have high security there. You couldn't allow people to walk through the site or anything. So you had to have high security. Those were wealthy people, and yet it couldn't look like you had high security, And this wrangling went on and on for some time. And then finally, one of the architects there said, wait a minute, out at the University of Washington, they've hired this new psychologist. Let's get him in here, see what he has to say. And so I'm, the young psychologist at the time going there, and I took a first look at it, and it definitely looks like a private enclave for the rich thing. I couldn't see how, it would be solved at all. And everybody thought, well, maybe something we just have to live with, and do they, take it into courts. And then I started thinking about it. I started thinking about isovis. And it turns out there's a way of solving the problem when you do isovis analysis, because there's something called a preferred imaging perspective. And a preferred imaging perspective is when you get a image in your mind's eye of what a building looks like, okay? And we can all do this, Imagine a building over there, imagine a building over there. We can all do this. Now the question is, where are you standing, or what position are you in when you're imagining this? Okay, that's your preferred imaging perspective. So my students and I did a little study. We went into downtown Seattle, little man on the street study, stopped passersby. We asked them 3 questions, just 3 questions. First question, that big empty lot up there, on the corner and so. They're going to put condominiums in there. Yes, everybody knew about it. Been very controversial, been in the papers. That was the first question, everybody knew. 2, can you get a good image in your mind's eye of what condominiums there might look like? Everybody could, all right. Third question, where are you standing when you're getting this image in your mind's eye? We didn't care what they thought they should look like. We wanted to know where they were standing. Turns out that everybody was standing down here on this corner, okay? Either there or halfway up this street here, which is called Pike Place Alley. They were standing there. This was their preferred image perspective. And they were looking up diagonally in the maximum variance of that isovis across that site. Now, what it done is the developer had always had buildings here up about 3 or 4 or 5 stories on that lower end because the city allowed them. They said you could build up to 6 stories there. Turns out that's the fact that people couldn't see diagonally up into that site from that point. That's what gave the impression of it being a private enclave for the rich. So you see what happened? We took that knowledge back to the developer and his design team. He immediately dropped this down low. He raised this up a bit, terraced it down, and then he opened this view here is the opening into the site from across the alley there. So you open a view into the site open a view up through the site. We took it back to the design commission, and immediately the design commission says, great, we love it, go for it. And that's the way reason why that Marketplace North condominiums ended up looking like it is. Well, this was greatly successful. I wanted to write it up, write a paper on it and everything. The developer grabbed me by my hairy throat and said, don't you dare. Don't tell anyone about this. I said, why not? He says, because if we do, they think we're messing with their heads. And so I didn't, and I think you're the first ones that I'm telling about this now, all these many, many, many years later. This was 78. So I think it's safe enough to let the secret out now that, yeah, we do mess with people's heads when we mess with the space between an isosphere. That's the whole idea. That's the way we solve problems. Okay, why can we do this? We can do this. These things work because the way we experience landscapes, the way we experience environments, it's in our genes, and it's been formed by nature with our experience in nature over our long evolutionary history. As one of my favorite architects, Richard Neutra, said, he said, we didn't merely get used to nature. Our nervous systems, our neural processes were formed by nature. And it's amazing that an architect had this insight. This was back in the 50s and 60s when American psychology was just messing around with behaviorism, totally mired in behaviorism. And it's sad that his work, so much of his work, never made it into environmental psychology. And I'm now on the Neutra board of the Neutra Institute, and we're trying to overcome some of this and get a lot of these early realizations into the literature. Okay, so here's the environment that the human brain and human perceptual processes actually grew up in. It's the African savanna. And the African savanna is actually, it's a space between. It's a transitional space. It's a transitional space between deep forests and between completely open prairie. And what happened is starting about 8 million years ago, you had this great drying out of East Africa, tectonic events drying out of East Africa. And so all the forests started to wither away. And all of the generalized primates that were in those forests were forced out onto savannas. And those that made it, went on to become our ancestors. Those that didn't, became fossils in history. But surviving on an African savanna with all of the spatial properties and visions and thoughts that you had to encode and learn to operate within, we carry these around with us still. And once you understand a lot of these spatial kinds of perceptual habits or perceptual encoding principles that strategies that the human brain picked up, you start to understand, and you can, why things work for us the way they do, why we design the way we do, and how you can utilize those. Now, what it means is that you can create buildings that act as habitats, act as natural habitats. You can bring these spatial compositions and the lighting and everything like that into buildings. And if we're biologically attuned to these natural habitats that we biologically grew up in, you bring those into buildings in the way of lighting, spatial arrangements, I think, then you can greatly increase human functioning and satisfaction in those kind of buildings. I've done a lot of work on green buildings, and it turns out that's the way why green buildings is good for people for their, as they are for the planet, because when they reproduce these qualities, we just function better in them. Everything works better. The term this is called the term is enaction, and enaction in neuroscience describes the structural coupling between neural processes, the way we go, and the structure that's out there in the environment. And when that structural coupling meshes, it brings forth a world, and it can bring forth a world in very, very satisfying ways. Now, one of the ways in which it brings forth a world is by looking at this underlying order that's in nature. And this is a fractal order, something called fractal. And one of my colleagues has called it a convergence of fractal order between mind and setting. And I really liked her term, so Louise Schaefer, so I've used it here. So we're going to go on and talk about a different type of space between now, and that's the fractal space. Fractals, mathematically, they're the space that lies between the cardinal dimensions. One is a line, you know, two is a surface, a two-dimensional surface, and then three-dimensional space is our three-dimensional space. So all of the space that lies between those cardinal dimensions is fractal space. And if you look at it, fractals are ubiquitous in nature. They describe the self-similar scalar order of everything from sand grains up to galaxies. There was an article in Science some years back that says, is the universe fractal? And yeah, it seems like, yeah, pretty much so. When we scale things out, the universe looks to, you know, be organized along a fractal order. So we can use this, okay? As architects and designers, we can use this. I started researching fractals because I was interested in you know, why green buildings work and whether it was the fractal qualities of green buildings that were causing all the occupant benefits. So I started to research fractal order. And I found out, of course, that Richard Neutra had got there first, even though he was talking about it before fractals were discovered. But one of his famous quotes is that no one laments the monotony or uniformity of a tree. And it captures the idea that fractals are a likeness tempered with a difference, visually to us. That is, things, in other words, as another colleague of mine put it, nature rhymes, okay? Nature doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And that's what you want to do. You want to put rhyming into your settings, not repetition into your settings. And when you're doing that, that's when you're starting to capture fractal qualities. So fractals, they provide this sort of underlying structural invariant that actually gets human perception and cognition going. And we can show, and I have shown, unfortunately, in research I can't publish because it's all for private companies, shown how you increase the, say, the fractal order and fractal qualities in work environments and surround work environments, and people work better. Their short-term memory, working memory is improved, perceptual reasoning is improved. There are better types of spaces for thinking spaces than a lot of the spaces we put people into, and there's a this keeps showing up, you know, in subtle ways and things that you may have recognized. So, for example, I'm going to ask you now, how many of you in your education, you know, you've had a class and then you're going to have the final exam, okay? And when you have the final exam, they change the room on you. And now they tell you, oh, you've got to go have, you know, you had the final exam in a different hall than you did where you had the entire class. Did that ever happen to any of you? Can I see some hands or something? Anybody? You're all asleep.
No, we're not.
You had that happen to you?
Yes,
okay.
It did to me.
Yes.
All right. And when it happened to you, did you find that exam, what was your feeling about the exam and the hardness, the difficulty of the exam?
It was chaotic.
Yeah, yes, that's right. No, this phenomenon of switching, you know, to a different room or something when you take an exam, it's so well known, it's studied in educational psychology. Okay, it's studied in educational psychology as to why this is the case, and nobody can figure out why this is the case. Well, turns out there's a good reason, and it's the fractal order of your learning environment that causes this. Here's what's happening. As you're sitting there taking a class, listening to the instructor, your eyes are saccading, they're flitting around the classroom, and they're stopping very temporarily on many different points in the classroom as you're encoding the information. When the eye rests momentarily at a particular point in the classroom, that retinal address is used as an address of the item you're trying to learn and to put it into short-term memory. Later on, when you want to recall that item, your eye flicks back to that point, and when it hits that retinal address, it uses that as the tag to go into short-term memory and to get the item. And that short-term memory is used to get it and put it into long-term memory. So guess what? Guess what types of learning environment spaces are best for doing this? Spaces that have the kind of fractal order in them that are rich enough that you have a lot of these little sense points that are differential, that you can differentiate as retinal coordinates. When you go into a new room, a totally different room, all of those coordinates change. You've never learned all that stuff in that room before, okay? So recalling it is much, much more difficult. There's a whole line of research going on about this too. That's been discovered. It's called deictic processing. It means pointing. Deictic means pointing. So it's all the ways in which the eye points out, locks onto features in the environment, uses that, encodes that, brings it into as access to short-term and then long-term memory. This is how the structure of the environment actually gets caught up in your thinking processes. You know, your mind is not inside your brain alone. It's part of it is looped out into the environment that's involved in the actual mental processes that you're engaged in. And it's the fractal quality of those settings that assists this. Okay, once we know this, we can use this in all kinds of things, not only for thinking, but also particularly for emotional kinds of effects. So looking there on the left, that house, that's the house that I designed for our retirement home, and it's very fractal. It's got fractal proportions. I fractally proportioned it and fractally proportioned the inside spaces of the way they divide out and everything like that. And I must admit, it's been wonderful living in it. And people walking past it, they stop and they like it a lot. It seems to have a lot of what we call street appeal. And this starts to show that the use of fractal proportions in architecture and facades and everything, can be a very successful use. This also, by the way, was done part that way because I use it as a passive solar design. All of those gables shade various parts of the roof as the sun goes across the sky. It's not very good for if I wanted to add solar panels, but at my time, the city where I live in didn't allow solar panels on roofs. They do now. But it's a wonderfully passively designed solar house, and I could go on for a long time about the high energy efficiency of the house. But anyway, on the other one, so there it's a large scale on the size of a dwelling, small scale inside of an airplane cabin. Years ago, a design firm in Seattle discovered that this particular subdivision panel, bulkhead inside of airlines, when they put this kind of a pattern on it, people loved it, and they were calmer, and they seemed to, they didn't get as upset in the flights being inside a metal tube flying at 60,000 feet and all that sort of thing. And if you look at these patterns, these are fractal patterns. These are fractal rhythms. And there's a whole line of research now done on what fractal rhythms how fractal rhythms are perceived and how they can be used. And in fact, for other clients, I've solved problems by adjusting the roofline of buildings to have the same fractal rhythm as their backgrounds, so that when you look at them from a preferred imaging perspective in different parts of the city, the building seems to blend in to the background, to a natural background better. And this also solved, some problems when they were up against design commission saying your building stands out too much and we don't want it to stand out. Well, how do you do it? Well, one of the things is you adjust the fractal rhythm of your roof line, because that's again where the brightness ratio is the difference against usually a bright background and against the roof line edge. So I mean, this is where fractal strategies become very important. Okay, people are using fractal strategies to make interior spaces more appealing. This is a architect researcher over in Singapore. And so she was looking at medical buildings, putting nature fractals on tops of ceilings so that when you're laying in bed or laying in an exam table or something, you're looking up at what looks to be like trees or what looks to be like clouds. This has become a very, very big business in the medical field these days of enhancing medical interiors using naturalistic settings. And what's really going on there is you're recreating a fractal environment, a very beneficial fractal environment for people. Here's a very clever one against that same researcher in Singapore. You look over there, here's the typical hospital bedroom. Here's an ideal hospital bedroom. If you look out and see trees, there's a lot of research that shows people can look out and see trees from hospital beds. They get well quicker, they have less complications, everything like that. Here's an artificial tree view. These are mullions on the window, okay? And this is painted on hiding the medical equipment behind the bed. So it gives you the sense of looking out the window and having space subdivided in a fractal pattern when in fact it's mullions on a window. And she was doing this research some years ago. I'm not sure how it all started out or how it all's finished up yet, but she was having very positive results the last time I talked with her. It goes on. You can look at fractal rhythms, and she was also looking at fractal rhythms in these railings in hospitals to get people to walk. Usually these railings are just flat, but by putting a fractal rhythm, you see how the fractal into the way the railing goes up and down. She found out that people like to walk more. It's just feeling more comfortable and rewarding to walk by having your hands sliding along a rhythmic kind of handrail. And I've often thought that, you're trying to get people to use stairs. I've often wondered why we didn't use this kind of strategy on the design of stair rails in buildings. Okay, getting into some of the techniques of this. Back in 1987, myself and a master's student at NASA Ames, we were doing a study on enhancing crew cabins in potential space stations. And we looked at murals, whether we should have nature murals, because just then the idea of having nature have benefits for people was just getting into the literature. So we ran an experiment. And what we did is we'd have people do different types of mental exercise, and it was either mental arithmetic, a logic problem, or creative thinking. Is red or logic, and we drive them up. This is their galvanic skin response. Goes up, you're stressed, down, you're not stressed. And so we drive them up, and then we'd let them relax for a bit. Drive them up, let them relax, and we take them through various cycles. And so this shows an example of what the different cycles were looking like. This was the tasks. And so you can see people recovering. And what we looked at is whether people recovered different when they had different types of murals to look at. And our different types of murals, one was a nature, a mountain waterscape scene, and one was that panel that I showed you that was sort of like a hazy savannah. And then we had a panel that was just some some lines on it, some squares and lines, a modern panel. And then we had nothing, a control condition. We thought, when we started the experiment, we all thought that this nature scene, this mountain waterscape scene, was going to be the one, if anyone would reduce stress, the mountain waterscape scene would. Turned out it wasn't. It was that previous panel that I showed you. It was that one that had this low, that people recover the most when they were allowed to have a rest period, and their galvanic skin response would go down. It wasn't until 2002, when I was a guest professor down at the University of Oregon, that I met a physicist down there. He was doing work on fractals. We talked and we said, let's run these panels, they thought, through your fractal measurements, his computer program that we had, and see what the differences are. And sure enough, what we found is that this panel that had been successful, this one was right in the waterhole range, what we call the waterhole range of fractals, which is where you have the best human response. This panel, the nature scene, was up at the high end. In other words, it was too enclosed. Remember that I told you about expanse in the hippocampus? Well, there wasn't enough expanse in that one, but there was in the naturalistic one. Even if it didn't have a nature scene, the fractal dimensionality of it was ideal. Okay, so this set off a whole new other line of research now, looking at fractal dimensionality and how you can measure fractal dimensionality and put it into imagery and things like this, or into design of spaces to enhance the emotional effectiveness of those spaces and the satisfaction of those spaces. And that research has gone on for years. I've got a friend of mine named Laura Mercurio. She's a fabric designer, and she designs fabrics for healthcare applications. And these are fabrics, for example, if you go in and you're in a hospital bed, and they draw the curtain around you, well, what's on that curtain? It used to be plain curtain. Now it may be a pattern like this. And this was one of her earlier patterns. She called it beaches. And she deliberately designed this pattern from a fractal's perspective, that is manipulating the fractal qualities of the pattern. It turned out to be the best-selling pattern that the fabric firm that she sold it to had that year. And she's gone on to a stellar career of making different types of fractal patterns for healthcare applications. And she's now working with me and a psychiatrist over in Australia, and another a woman, a friend of Sandra's, and we're investigating the use of fractal patterns in psychiatric wards, closed psychiatric wards. So we're just getting started on that. So there's lots of places you can take this space between. You can look at air movement and composition, the breezes. And you talk about, when you look at people in space stations, when they say, yeah, I miss the breezes, and it's the airflow is always the same. Soundscapes have a fractal pattern. Thermal comfort has fractal patterns. Lighting has fractal patterns. We've got the interior views, the spatial proportions, the visual texture. There's fractal, all of these has fractal statistics in them too that describe these. You can start to investigate and utilize all of these to enhance isolated and confined environments, like here's an Antarctic research station. And Sandra and her colleague, Cheryl Bishop, myself and others, like I say, are now looking at the deliberate use of fractals, the space between, to enhance isolated and confined environments. So my lessons to you on this is that when you think about this, since fractals start at the very bottom of things, you start to realize that they're really important about things about orders proceeding from the bottom up, not the top down. And the design hierarchy of needs has it backwards, because fractals are aesthetics, and if you start with aesthetics and fractal aesthetics, you end up getting a lot of other things. So you shouldn't keep aesthetics out until the end. You should put it in at the beginning. And the space between, in a lot of different ways, is the one that I think is still in design most in need of exploration. In closing, I want to say there's just one more space between that's of particular importance to me now, and that is that the realization that time, is involved in this too, and we all live in logarithmic time. You may not have noticed it yet, but as you get older, you'll notice that time flows much faster. You first start noticing this in your 40s, like, where did the morning go? And by the time you're my age, I'm 76, time is just racing past, absolutely racing. So here's a little technique. I won't go through it with you now, but we live in logarithmic time, and it means that the older you get, the faster time goes. So you can do this little calculation, or you can go out on the web and you can find this, and you can find things that'll do it for you. And I did it for myself. And it shows me that if I expect to live until 90, and I picked that age because my mother died at 89, and I figure I'm going to beat her by 1 year at least. Then it means that in those 16 years or those 14 years I've got left to me, they'll seem like the 11 years from this reference age. So I'm going to live them as fast as I've lived the past 11 years. And the older I get, the faster it's going to go. So you've got a lot of time left yet. But I want to remind you that it's just going to get faster and faster. Don't put anything off. Whatever gives you joy, do it now and achieve now while you can. And thank you. That's it as far as the prepared slides. So I will escape from this and hopefully bring back to Sandra and other people.
Thank you very much.
Everybody still there?
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
What a wonderful talk. Thank you very much.
I hurried, I know I hurried.
I'll give my students the chance to ask questions. You have mentioned a lot of topics that I think they are thinking about. So please write in the chat or write me if you would like me to introduce you. Otherwise, just ask the question.
Yeah, if I may start. Thank you so much for the wonderful talk. It was really, really interesting. I really like these when topics like these are approached from such a scientific point of view. What especially resonated with me was where you talked about the how we ingrain what we learned into the space where we learned it. Because I personally, I see myself as a person who's who thinks everything as space, and everything even time, even very abstract thoughts are all, I always think, when I think of them, I recall a space, even a random space. So what I wanted to ask you is if you have any further reading you can recommend, any books on these, on the general subject, or have you written any books on this, or what are your favorite books on these spatial perception subjects?
Yeah, I've written I've written some articles that have been published on fractals in design. And Sandra, did I send you the list of articles, or didn't I? Did I forget to send you some of my past articles?
No, you sent me a link, but not a list of your articles.
Okay, I'll do that. I will do that. Thank you I'll do that. The other thing is, let me hold this up. Fractals, fractal geometry in architecture and design. If you're going to take one book, go to one book and look at all this and start, this book by Carl Bolville, I know him personally. This is the best book to start with still. Mm-hmm. And it's a wonderful introduction to fractals, and it's a wonderful introduction to all the ways in which they become manifest in architecture and design. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't go into the psychological or perceptual side of things as much, but it does go into the architecture, design strategies, and also the math basis of it. And it's good to have a basic understanding of that. And by the way, you mentioned time, and there's a famous saying that time is the space between memory and anticipation. So time is also seen as the space between. From that perspective, so you're right about that in your feelings.
And one further question: do you also have a book recommendation about topics like ISOVIST or the topics that you talked in the first half of your talk?
Oh wow, yeah, I can. There's lots of articles out about ISOVIST. ISOVIST have become a huge area of research over the past 30, 40 years. So you can Google it up and find it. But I can send a couple of my favorites too. The thing about ISOVIST that I want to warn everyone about is that since they've become popular, something essential has been lost since their original formulation. And their original formulation, the architect who discovered them and really started working with, his name is Michael Benedict. He's the one who did it for his master's thesis, Michael Benedict. And then he went on to do other things. But remember, Michael Benedict, the ISOVIST is important because it's your viewpoint, it's where you're standing. When a lot of ISOVIST calculations was automated and put into things you can get off the web very easily, they don't calculate ISOVIST from where you're standing, viewpoints. They calculate ISOVIST from all the long views. They just draw lines, ray lines all throughout an interior space. So when they calculate an ISOVIST from like all possible viewpoints, well, there's a lot of places where you'd never experience a space from. So it destroys that personal part of it. And then people wonder when they look at ISOVIST measures they use now and say, wow, these aren't predictive, they're not working for me. Well, because the way they're calculating them is wrong. It's lost the essential component of what an ISOVIST means, which is that experience of space as you move through it or as you look at it from a particular point. So that's the only caution I'll give everyone when you start looking at some of these or downloading some of these tools that'll calculate ISOVIST for you these days. But I'll send you also a couple of, you can look at Michael Benedict's original writings. I think they're on the web. Benedikt, that's the way he describes it. He's originally from South Africa, Benedict, Dikt.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
I also have a question. First, I wanted to thank you about your lecture. It was very interesting. And the question is about the fractals and the fractal space, and how does one measure this ideal fractal dimensionality?
Okay. has a page on, but I can describe it relatively simply. You do what's called a box count, basically, and you do a box count at various levels of scale. So it's like taking a grid, and you put a grid over a scene, and then you say, where in that grid is there something? Is space filled? And you count that up, okay? And then you take a larger grid or a smaller grid, and then your smaller grid, where is it filled? And you keep doing that. And then you sum up and calculate across those various grids. So what you're getting when you get fractal dimensionality, what it really is a measure of how much space is filled. Okay, that's what it really measures. So you can see now why this is important to the human visual system, especially growing up on a visual system coming of age in a savanna. How much space is filled is part of a signal of, well, if it's filled too much, then there's too much room for predators there to be hiding that you can't see. If it's not filled at all, there's nothing I can run to hide in if a predator does come. So the filling of space and what's coming next. And by the way, our perception, it isn't about reproducing the world. It's about telling us what's coming next. That's what our perception is doing. Perception is a prediction machine. That's what it is. So being able to look into space and see what's coming next to keep the world constant, to keep the world stable, that's what's happening in human perception. So the fractal quality, the fractal dimensionality of that is critically important. Now, there's other aspects of fractal dimensionality that are important too, the other statistics. For example, there's another statistic of fractals that describes the spikiness of the environment, how things come to a point. Well, you can see how that's important too, to a hominid running around the savanna. Spikes or thorns, round things might be edible, okay? You add color to that and everything, you're starting to find resources then, as opposed to finding, thorn bushes. There's another measure, statistical measure of fractal that it's really clever. It tells you how much of the pattern you're seeing may be hidden. That is, in a fractal statistic, it's also saying it's also revealing not how much is there, but how much is there that you can't see. Well, you could say, whoa, that's also very important to a visual system to detect how much of a partially visible pattern may be obscured. So when you start looking at fractal statistics, you see all of these kinds of cues that if a visual system picks it up, boy, I mean, it has high survival value for that visual system. So it's no wonder that the more we look into manipulating fractal qualities of settings, the more we find that we can have significant psychological benefits, perceptual benefits, mental operation benefits, just by playing around with those. Because they're there. They're all, and by the way, all of these are below human awareness. And we feel it, or it just works better, but we don't know why.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Unless I get another question, I'm going to start talking again. And you don't want me to do that. Well, let me ask you, what you guys, come on, some of you guys must be doing things that you always wanted to ask a psychologist about. As long as it's not your love life, I'd be glad to answer,
Yeah, I'd be interested in whether or not you have, because that's something that I mentioned before in my question, about how I think of everything I think of as a space. But when I started a couple of months ago, I started asking other people, for example, the question, if you think of a year, or if you think of any date in the past, what is in your head? And to me, I automatically assumed that in everyone's head, there must be some kind of visual representation of what is a year. For me, it's a circle where there's the months and the winter is on the bottom, and on top there's the summer. And depending on how important the months are to me, they are bigger or smaller on that circle. So I imagined that something like that must exist in all people's heads, some kind of visual representation of time, for example, or of everything. But then I noticed that a lot of people seem to not visualize things spatially at all. And I was wondering whether you have done any research on that, or looked into any research on that, how people visualize things, or what contributes to people visualizing something or not visualizing something.
Well, what you've described is what makes you an architect. you've chosen the right career path for yourself, because you're also right. There are people who are totally symbolic thinkers, and they never visualize a thing. To them, it's all symbol manipulation. And in fact, when I learned statistics myself, I had a terrible time with it when I was an undergraduate, because it was taught to me all as symbol manipulation. And it wasn't until I got into graduate school, and my advisor, whom I still wonderful friends with, he was a professor who visualized statistics, and he taught me statistics all over again to visualize them. So naturally, when I got into teaching statistics myself, and I had design students come in, I had to adjust all my teaching. And whenever I had a formula to teach, I wouldn't start out with the formula, but I'd start out with a visualization of like, what is this formula going to tell you? And so like, well, the mean of a distribution is the center of gravity of a distribution. The variance of a distribution is the moment of inertia of a distribution. And you can see that in how things spin. And there's good reason for this, because the people who invented statistics, they came out of physics, and they were looking at solid bodies, and they said, gee, a body of data, of numbers, is like a solid body. And so they deliberately made it that way. So these visual connections are there. It's just that when people who teach statistics, they're all into symbol manipulation, they just don't bother with them. But the reason I was very successful as a statistics teacher, because I adjusted my lectures to put in all these visualizations for the design students. They learned statistics. And in fact, it helped a lot of other people too. And I ended up getting a teaching award from the university for statistics. Nobody ever gets an award for teaching statistics, but I did, because it turned out to be a very popular class. That's why I say I owe them as much as I taught them. But you're right, you guys, you're visual thinkers. And there are many people, they're symbolic, totally symbolic thinkers, and or sometimes interpersonal thinkers. There's a lot of research done on this, and it's called, different types of intelligence: visual intelligence, emotional intelligence, et cetera, et cetera. But these are different cognitive styles. And you as architects, you have to be aware of this. It helps to be aware of this, because a lot of your clients, they're not. They're it's like those guys on the design commission back at the university, back in the city of Seattle. They weren't architects. They were business people. Okay, and they could look at that condominium complex being proposed. We don't like it. Looks like a private enclave for the, but they couldn't tell you what to do about it. Drove the developer, drove the architects nuts. Tell us what you want and we'll give it to you. Couldn't tell you, just go fix it. In the business, consulting business, we call this find me a rock problem. Your clients will say, find me a rock, okay? You bring them a rock and they say, no, not that rock, a different rock. You keep bringing them rocks. You know, if they're paying you for this, but they only do that in the government, that's great. You can keep bringing them rocks. But if you're doing this on your own time, if you're trying to solve a problem, it's terrible. And so a lot of time that difference is like they can't visualize what they really want to solve it. And that, like I say, that's why thinking about things in preferred imaging perspectives or stuff, they're saying that, asking people, where are you thinking of it from, or this helps. We did a lot of, sometimes it hurts though. We did a lot of work with low-income housing when I was back at the University of Washington. And if you go out and ask residents, residents who are at the lower end of the economic spectrum, who are looking into or who are eligible for low-income housing, you ask them new low-income housing, said, what do you want? What are they all going to tell you? They want a house with a little picket fence and a little yard in front. They want their own. Well, you can't give them that. It's too expensive. You're going to be in multifamily housing is what you're going to be in. So what you have to ask them instead is, what do you want to do? What do you want to experience? What do you want to feel like? And once you ask them that, then you can figure out ways of giving them the experiences that they would have if they had a house and a little picket fence around it. But when they don't have, you can't give them a house with a little picket fence about it, but you can give them the same sense of that and the same experience and the views you construct and how you organize the spaces and break it up and things like that. So yeah.
Thanks for that.
You're welcome.
Yeah. Do you have any other tools like that? Any other like tricks up your sleeve for situations like that, for translating needs into solutions?
I am nothing but tricks up my sleeve. One of the most useful I've found, sort of a mental trick, is the fact that when you put out a problem, or you recognize a problem, an issue, and this works whether you're all designers and visual thinkers or not. Have you noticed people tend to come in at various levels of the problem? That is, some people sort of see it globally. Oh, this is a problem in universal emancipation or something like that. And another person looks at, they're down there at this tiny, tiny level, and they're seeing this at the most particular way. And a lot of times when things are thrown out, it's this difference of scale, okay? So you've got a space between, this is space between, again, space between thinking. People are pointillist, people are globalists. And I found what we did in all of my design studios is we'd say, okay, we're going to have to design this multifamily housing. And here's the brief we've been given, everything. What are your thoughts? And we'd take each thought and we'd write it down on a little piece of paper like this. There would be no evaluating of the thought. We've just, if there was a question on it, like here's what I think, what kind of problem it is, or what this is an aspect of the problem. You could ask that question to elaborate, to sort of like clarify it, but you couldn't say things like, oh, come on, that's crap, that's ridiculous, No, we just get them all. And maybe we'd get like 50 or 60 of these, we put them all out on table in front of us. Just put them out. Now, we'd pick up one and we'd say, does this answer the question how or why? Two questions, how or why. Does this answer the question why of any of these other problems? Or does this answer the question how of any of these other problems? The question why takes you up a level of scale. Why do we do this? Well, in order to, how do we do this? Well, you take this and color it, or you remove the edge. So how takes you down, why takes you up. So we would then take all of these cards and we would order them from top to bottom down into hierarchies, which is why and which is how. And then this would spread out all of our thinking, very large scale to very scale. And then we'd start to see patterns emerge. We'd start to see, and we'd start to reorder the cards and rename the cards. And we'd say, oh, so this is really turns out to be thinking about, how the family stays together and how and this really turns out being about how do we handle children and children's recreation. And once we got these then into these descending arrangements, hierarchies, we could then start to work on the problem and say, how does design approach this? How can we reach over here and solve this and this one here? How do we connect them? Boy, that was a lifesaver. Just doing it that way, cutting out all of this argument over high scale stuff and low scale stuff is worth it's worth millions in time and effort to you guys if you're working in teams. So that is an exercise, even if it's just a mental exercise for yourself. That's one of those tricks of the trade.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. You should write a book just about because for example, the book about fractals that you showed me or showed us is something like very, very specific on this topic of fractals. But you should write a book about your tricks up your sleeve. I'd buy that in a minute.
Thank you. You may have you may have convinced me that I've got so many books I've got to write. Really, and there's so many books, so little time.
Yeah.
Especially logarithmic time. Any projects, you guys? Sandra, go ahead.
We talked a bit about proxemics. You also did. Maybe you can say a little bit more what you think of this distinction between privacy and social space in this in-between spaces.
Yeah, private space and social space and in-between spaces. They're generally, generally, I think there always has to be a gradation. If there's a hard and fast distinction to be made, there's got to be a good reason, for it. And of course, a good reason is security. But otherwise, if you bring, part of the problems in urban design and such is that if you bring private space up, really private space up against really public space, then that junction always becomes a no man's land of space, it becomes nobody's space. And that's dangerous in urban environments. So this is why you see so much design that we say appropriates space. I don't know what the word in German might be, I forget, but we call it appropriation of space in English, in architecture. And that is, you extend an overhead element out over a sidewalk partial ways. And just by extending that overhead element, you capture the sidewalk or that part of the side. So the sidewalk doesn't remain as anonymous as it did. You can capture, you can capture private space and public space in hotel corridors. And this is important too, because like the hotel room is private, the corridor space is public, or at least is open to everyone. If you look at the carpeting, a lot of the carpeting on hotel spaces, corridor spaces will be lined up so that you've got a a very sharp delineation between the space right alongside the wall and the door, and sometimes even the door space outside the front of the door will be carpeted differently or different carpet pattern than the space where where walking is. That's deliberate. That's meant to keep people walking so that it tells you this is a walking space, but that right here in front of the door, that's captured, it's appropriated, to that room. So you don't stand outside a room and talk to each other, or carry on, that sort of thing. So like, that's what I said, whenever you bring up a private space against a public space, you have to appropriate it or assign it in different ways. If not, it tends to be taken over. And a lot of times it can be taken over for purposes that you don't want it to be taken over for. Again, security-wise, for example, in parking garages, we used to have a lot of problem in parking garages with people being robbed as they went to cars, and women being assaulted, as they went to their cars. And how do you solve this? Well, your car is your private space, but the garage is public space. And one of the ways you reduce this is through a lighting strategy. It's called SALI, Supplementary Aerial Lighting. And what it means is that when you come out, say you come out of an elevator to your area of the garage, of the parking garage, and you've got on your card or something, it says where your car is. What you do is there's a row of switches there. You punch one, and all of a sudden you get a huge influx of light, bright light over that area. Well, if anybody is hiding there waiting for you, this startles the heck out of them, okay? And they leave. Now you say, well, it also tells anybody where you're going. Sure, but it's high illumination. It says you're under view. And so this is a strategy that's used to cut down assaults in parking garages here. So again, capturing the juncture between private space and public space, you have to capture it for the intended use you want. If you don't, that in-between space can be utilized by someone else.
And I have one more question to you. When we look at small, tiny, confined environments, then this may be even more difficult, right? Because there is no distinction between private, personal, social. Sometimes it's overlapping. Do you think that people really need a physical space to own or to take over?
Last question first. Absolutely. Absolutely. And in fact, one of the things I'm sorriest about is that when the International Space Station first got going, they didn't have any of the private crew cabins in it. And now I think they may have put some back in some of the modules they've added. But all of the work we did indicated that, yes, especially for any kind of longer term habitation, you need your private space. And we showed all the different ways you can size it. In fact, we had a dictum, that came out of that, and the dictum said, it's not how large you make it, it's how you make it large. So you could have it very, very tight, very confining, but as long as, for example, it's irregular, so you've got longer views inside, as long as you've shaped it so that you can, what we call the isokin, you can move through the space and put on clothes without constantly running into the walls, the bulkheads of the space. And you can measure that precisely. You can end up with a very, very habitable small space. And interestingly enough, in recent works on homelessness, you know, where they're trying to house people because we have such a homeless problem in some large cities in our country, what they're finding out is that even if you take people into a large auditorium, you know, where you're going to house them temporarily, used for homeless, if you give people inside of that auditorium individual shelters, however small, but individual enclosed shelters, you end up with a much more satisfied, restful population that doesn't have all the problems and social problems that are going on with interaction with them. You give people their own space. And that lesson keeps learned again and again. We're now starting here in other cities in the United States using what they call tiny houses. Some of you may be aware of the tiny house movement. Houses anywhere between 200 and 400 square feet. And they're now building tiny house communities for homeless people because they're learning the lesson that you can have people much more successful in life and in getting out of homelessness much easier and much faster if you give them their own private space, enclosed, you know, no matter how small it is, like say even 200, 400 square feet. And there's a way you can do it to make it seem and feel large.
And that would be through high variance in the
ISOVIS, outside views. You can substitute ceiling space for floor space. That's a trick we learned in the Market Space North condominiums because I continued to work with the developer on that, and we were one of the first people to develop the idea that, you know, we want to sell a condominium, we want to sell it for so much money, but we can't make it that big because we've got to make so many condominiums here. So how do we make the condominium look bigger than it does? And the thing from the ISOVIS work, we just increase the height of the ceiling. And it turns out that they were looking at 8-foot ceilings then. We went up to 10-foot ceilings. All of a sudden, you know, you keep the same space, but a 10-foot ceiling. And you could sell it for the same amount of square footage as if it were a much larger space. Another thing that we learned on that, and that I brought back from my year at NASA, is that when you enter a space, even a small space, you should enter it on the diagonal. And because if you enter it on the diagonal, you're increasing the variance of the entry ISOVIS. And by increasing that variance, you're making the space not only seem bigger, but you're making it seem more alive. So the activity level of the space goes up, the spaciousness goes up. He used this, my friend, the developer, used this on another set of condominiums he was developing on Capitol Hill at the time, and it was a very hot competitive market. And we arranged the entries to ours so that you came in on the diagonal, and there was a diagonal wall there that came around, you came around. Everybody who walked into and saw those condominiums, they said, we love it. He sold them out like 3 times faster than any of his competitors did up there, just by this trick of manipulating an entry ISOVIS. You can see restaurants doing this too. They'll take tables and they'll turn them diagonal to the walls, and all of a sudden the restaurant seems to come alive inside. So just the way you proportion, just the way you block view space inside by putting a table on a diagonal makes the space come alive and increases the variance of the interior ISOVIS.
And when you say variance of the ISOVIS, that means having very long views and very short views.
Yeah, the more different kind of views you can have in terms of length of ISOVIS radial, if you think about it that way. We want to get a lot of different ISOVIS radials. See, then we can get into a really thing. Well, what about the stepwise difference, like how an ISOVIS radial changes from one to the next? Oh, there's a whole bunch of research you can do on that too. I mean, like this stuff you know, like I say, you can get technical and you can really get clever about how you manipulate things. But it's never an accident, never an accident.
I have a question, maybe I can add on the topic of the ISOVIST, because now when we talk about ISOVIST, we always talked about visual, spatial experience. And I want to ask, take it a step further and ask, how does also the materials, the colors and the textures of this room play a role of interpretation? Because maybe in an illustration, the ISOVIST is the only thing we can transfer at this moment, but in the experience afterwards, it will also play a big role.
You are absolutely right. I'm so glad you raised that question, because if you take a look at the mathematics and the analysis of ISOVIST, it doesn't make any difference, you know, what that surface is colored, as long as it's an obscuring edge or surface. According to the ISOVIST math, it's all the same. But we know it isn't the same, you know, the color makes a difference. One of the obvious ways in which you do this is is with a mirrored surface. So you can increase the distance of an interior ISOVIST by putting a mirror in a corner, you know, and bouncing it off. And so you increase spaciousness with mirrors. Well, you can see how that does that, because that simply increases the length of the ISOVIST radial. You can do what's done inside of small elevators, and you can create sort of this infinity space where they'll run mirrors around the top of the interior of the elevator space and put lights in it, and then shoot a light into the mirror. And so you look up into the top of the elevator, then it looks like you got this receding infinity of lights going off in these two different directions. And this, of course, greatly increases the spaciousness of inside the elevator. And they do that for people who may be queasy inside of elevators on long elevator rides. Yeah, things like colors.
I have a question about mirrors in elevators, because I've read an article a few years ago that it's clever to put mirrors in elevators also because people don't want to see themselves vandalize stuff. So it's like subconsciously they don't want to see how they like destroy something in an elevator. So they put mirrors also as not only for the space reason, but also because of that into elevators.
Yes, yeah, mirrors works as a great anti-vandalism tool. And in fact, we've stopped a lot of vandalism in university dormitories. You know, you get all these guys and they're waiting for the elevators, and while they're waiting for the elevators, what do? They're kicking walls and things like this. No, you just put a mirror there right there by the elevator. And now what are they doing? Now they're checking their fly, they're checking their hair, you know, things like this. So it takes up time and it gives you something else to do. And it also sort of seeing other people seem like it makes you feel like you're on display. And anytime you make people feel they're on display, they're less likely to damage something. Yeah. So yeah, you can play around with mirrors and textures and colors to really start to refine the treatment of a space. Once you've got the spatial proportions and things like that down to think what you want to do with your general strategy, you can carry it all through by how it's finished off. Yeah, and if you want to ask about colors, boy, you know, ask Laura Mercurio. She's an expert in coloring spaces. And that when I showed you the slide of her beaches fabric, you know, the selection of colors there was no accident either. You know, the color contrast, the brightness contrast between them and everything, that was all precisely determined. And we could, you know, I could come back and give you another 2 hours on color, because I did, we did down at NASA, we did the biggest review of color, the use of color for interior and space stations and space habitats that had ever been done before, because NASA wanted to see, is it real? Would coloring inside of things really make any difference? And the answer is, oh yes, it would. And so we ended up with the biggest review of color that had been done, scientifically that far.
I'd definitely be up for that 2 hours talk on colors.
Yeah, we could easily. Don't get me started on colors. Come on, don't not get me started on colors. And the distribution of color receptors in the retina, that goes right back to the savannah too, the different types of color receptors. And we even have a degenerate color vision. We're not nearly as good as birds, but it's right there. And it's highly attuned to, savannah landscapes and all. So now don't get me started on colors. But I used to give my students, or when I give a talk or something, I used to give them sort of this thought problem. I'd say, imagine that, you're a alien species, and you can imagine yourself as anything except human. You're not human. You could be just pure gas. You could be fish. You could be anything. And the thing is, you find in deep space, you find a frozen, perfectly preserved human astronaut. Okay. And in your culture, you have an obligation, if you find someone like this, to return them to their home planet. But now you're in deep space, and how do you find the guy's home planet? As if you analyze the human body just with the tools we have today, if you analyzed it, would you be able to, in the whole galaxy, come back and find Earth and find this planet? You think about that. Is there enough cues in the way we're built and managed that you would come back and find Earth in a whole galaxy of stars and planets? And the answer is, oh yeah, right with the tools we have today. We carry so much of our Earth and our gravity and our sun and everything with us just by looking at the distribution of cones in retina, relative size of things, everything. It tells you everything about what kind of gravity field we had to live in, what kind of sun we had to live under. They'd come back, they'd nail us immediately if they found one of us out there. Oh yeah.
That's interesting, because I read something that basically said the complete opposite, from another point of view, that we are made up of exactly, what was it, hydrogen, and carbon, and so when you list the elements in our body by their mass, by the proportion of mass, it's exactly the same list as the entire universe.
Oh yeah. I mean, we're certainly made up of universal elements when you get down to that scale. Yeah. I mean, hydrogen, oxygen, everything, star stuff, built in the first stars. Yeah, you can trace us all the way back to that. But when you start looking at, the fact that we have eyebrows, the fact that we, have a nose, the fact that, we're as tall as we are, and the fact that we're bilaterally symmetric, quadrupedal bipeds, all of this is informative. And that's what you can use to reason back to the kind of world we had to have come from. The really much more interesting question, though, is our intelligence. The intelligence by which we understand and know the universe. And Einstein, one of his most famous questions was, he said the enduring mystery is the understandability of the universe. Is how come we can, apparently develop a mathematics and a way of understanding the universe that we can really figure out how it's going on, and go there. We can land things on Mars, for heaven's sakes. How do we do this? And would all intelligence have to develop that way, or is it just ours? We get lucky, and how did that happen? I could talk a whole course on that. This is the work I'm doing with my old advisor yet. It's called The Theory of Narrative Thought. And it says, we're storytelling animals. Why are we storytelling animals? And you can go back and trace that to our evolutionary history too. And if you do that, it actually looks like, say, God, we just may be unique. There may be a lot of other intelligent or living beings around this universe, but we just may be relatively unique in the way our intelligence came about, which means why we're able to go out and do space travel and everything. And that may be why nobody else is here right now. I'm being reminded that it's 10 o'clock and I'm taking up your time. See, yeah, but no, these things lead into lots of other wonderfully exciting fields.
Jim, thank you
Yes.
very much. I think we really have to leave now.
Yes, you do.
Is there one last question? We can have one last question, but then I have to thank you a lot, and I can forward the work on colors to my students.
Okay.
I have PDF. It's really good work. And if you could send me a list that I can forward to them as well, would be lovely.
Yes, I'll do
Send
that.
us all your favorite articles and papers, all of them.
I'll see what I can do there. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll be waiting on your book to read your new book.
Yeah, me too. Hey, thanks so much, guys. I really enjoyed this. I really appreciate it. Best of luck to you. Best wishes and all you and everything you do. Okay. Take care now.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.